Arctic sea ice extent isn't very important because the ice loses 2/3 of its area from March to September each year, an area the size of the United States. So the variance is tremendous. The Arctic Ocean is 2 miles deep with just a thin crust of ice on top, averaging 2 meters thick. But let's look at what we know about sea ice in the Arctic Ocean. Here's a picture of ice at the North Pole in March 2020. It's very close to the median for this time of year, well within natural variance. But sea ice extent doesn't really tell us much. Sea ice volume tells us more. Here we see winds pushing ice away from Russia, shown in blue, and packing the ice toward Canada, where it gets thicker, shown in red. Looking at the colored lines in the inset graph, we can see that sea ice volume is down this year and for the last several years in general. We've been using satellites to measure sea ice extent for 40 years now. Sea ice is declining. But what about before 1978? Two researchers have studied this. The first is Konstantin Vinnikov, who used declassified Russian records to reconstruct the past coverage of sea ice. This graph is practically the inverse of the temperature graph we've seen before. The second is Florence Federer, who reconstructed Arctic sea ice extent using many different sources of data, including ship logs, old photos, books, etc. The blue line shows that the permanent ice hasn't declined much. The red line shows the drop in sea ice extent satellites have measured, but it doesn't show any significant change to summer sea ice in the 1920s and 30s, when we know temperatures then were much higher. So I asked Federer if she had used newspaper accounts, and she said she hadn't. Tony Heller has a series of videos on YouTube where he uses newspaper clippings like these to show that the first half of the 20th century was very warm around the world. Here, the New York Times reports in 1958 that the ice pack was 40% thinner and 12% smaller than at the beginning of the century. There are many similar stories reported in Scandinavian newspapers. You know, it helps to have this kind of perspective rather than just looking at the last 50 years or so. Let's check the thermometers. Here are the recorded temperatures for several isolated stations around the Arctic Circle. And remember, isolated stations have the best data. Almost all of them show the same warm 30s and 40s, the same downtrend for the 50s and 60s, and then a gradual warming from there. As temperatures have risen slowly, Arctic sea ice is declining slowly and probably has been for the past 200 years. So what? Remember that 7,000 years ago, the Arctic was ice-free in summer. I'm willing to believe that there's less sea ice now than there was 40 years ago, but I don't think it means much. Because the ice is floating, a loss of sea ice doesn't raise sea levels. It just comes and goes in cycles that probably have nothing to do with carbon dioxide. Now, for ice that isn't floating, let's look at Greenland.